and gentlemen in England now abed shall think themselves accursed they were not here, and hold their manhoods cheap, whilst any speaks that fought with us upon St. Crispin's day. The 100 Years' War, a glorious period of English history where the lion was rampant, well, the leopard was passant, sorry. Old joke. The lily was livid, and good yeomen with bows put an end to dastardly French hopes and ran rampant all over France. Agincourt, Crecy, Poitiers, the Black Prince and Henry V, and English victory over the dastardly frog. Or at least that's the impression that exists, or that I think exists in the British, and I really mean English, consciousness. But is it true? No. Hang on, how can I say it's not true? Well, there were some stunning English victories and a whole lot of killed peasants and countryside burnt and looted. But the truth is that by the end of the wars, France remained French. England was much, much more English, and Calais was the only part of the continent still in English hands, which wasn't the case at the beginning of the fighting, when much more of what is now France was English. The French throne seemed within the English king's grasp time and again, or at least a negotiated peace that left them on much, much better terms. And France regularly found itself under enormous pressure, but changes in warfare and fantastic uses of firepower by the French, and changes in society, and even changes in what was meant by Frenchness and Englishhood, meant that the final result was victory for France, defeat for England, and the ground laid for a civil war in England known as the Wars of the Roses. Fought between 1337 and 1453, and between the Plantagenet dynasty of England and the House of Valois of France, over mostly sort of probably, don't want to get into details, but over the French throne and who should sit on it, because the best claim for power is not really the closest of blood or noble support, but who has victory on the battlefield. The 100 Years' War lasted for 116 years, with 35 years of that fighting being periods of peace, or at least declared peace, and then another 20 years at the end of the fighting before sort of an actual final peace was reached, which hasn't been included in that 116 years, so maybe 136 years. All that means really, and all that demonstrates, is that historians should not be allowed to name things. There were, broadly speaking, 3 periods of fighting during the 100 Years' War. The first phase between 1337 and 1360, then 9 years of peace before the rise of Charles V of France, and the second phase of fighting between about 1369 and 1389, and then a second peace for 26 years, so longer than the second phase of fighting, before Henry V of England resumed to pick up the baton and also, you know, the arrow and the broadsword and all other kinds of weapons, and resumed the fighting between 1415 and 1453. Now, without going into the which, what, wherefore, what, who's it, and so on of why it was fought, or who fought it, the first phase of warfare was pretty successful for England, with famous victories at Crecy and Calais and Poitiers and Neville's Cross, which was in England when it fought against the Scots, because the whole thing is much more complicated than 3 battles and Joan of Arc, all of which ended with Black Monday, which has nothing to do with economics, but it was when a freak hailstorm brought death and disaster for Edward III at Rheims, and that led to a negotiated peace. Did I mention that John the Good of France and David of Scotland, so both kings had been captured, been held in London, and the negotiations for ransoms were going on, ransoms which would be huge, huge sums of money. Also, have I mentioned that the Black Death had made its way into Europe? There was a whole lot of stuff going on. Well, the peace ended with the death of King John and the crowning of Charles V of France, but it ended over the Castilian throne, sort of, kind of, rather than the French one, after a bunch of fighting, the death of Edward III of old age, and Edward of Woodstock, better known as the Black Prince, due to ill health, Richard II took the throne as a child, and now high taxes in England and in France, and with the Black Death and the huge amounts of destruction and death and chaos and carnage and suffering caused by this long period of warfare, where even when it's not war, there is still, you know, if you take the war away from the armies still tend to make war. Well, it's all really unpopular amongst pretty much everybody. So a period of sort of peace, which contained all sorts of skirmishes and raids, neither officially sanctioned by either side, but possibly sponsored by them, along with all kinds of uprisings and civil wars, such as O England Hour in Wales and the Peasants' Revolt in England, meant that the peace, such as it was, well, it lasted until 1415, when Henry V of England famously led an expedition to Harfleur and then to Calais, stopping only for the Battle of Agincourt and tea and medals, restoring, starting again, the on-again, off-again period of heavy fighting and warfare in France. Henry was very nearly successful. He married Catherine of Valois, the closest blood claimant to the French throne. He spent time in Paris, which his Burgundian allies had captured. He had some stunning success on the battlefield before he became ill and died, leaving another infant on the English throne. Joan of Arc also appeared on the scene around then, renewing French spirits and marking a change of fortunes for the French. Joan lifted the siege of Orleans, I mean, not on her own. She was a mighty symbol and a lady that took the battlefield, but lots of other people also joined her. And that enabled the Dauphin of France, the French nobility, the French royalty, to assemble a new and modern army equipped with cannon. These are much lighter than the old siege engines, which required rivers to transport, and they were used with great success in a series of sieges and a series of battles that people in England have never heard of, culminating in the final great Battle of Castillon in 1453, which ended English hopes, but it was another 20 years before a treaty was signed off, bringing everything to an end, finally in 1475. Overall, the results were a definite win for the French House of Valois and for its allies. For a start, the French throne remained French, and the English and the French monarchies remained separate. The English claims to the French throne were, in effect, abandoned. Though the war had damaged France, it had strengthened the power and control of the French monarchy over both its traditional lands of France and the heartlands, but also over the duchies and counties of independent or semi-independent vassals that make up broadly what is now France. In England, however, the House of Plantagenet was weakened, which in turn led to the Wars of the Roses. In both England and France, there was a renewed, or just a new, sense of identity of what it meant to be English or to be French, leading arguably to a rise of national identities for the first time. However, the French crown remained French, and France was much more French, and England more English, even more unified between Norman and Saxon than it ever had been. The political, military and economic rivalries between the two countries was very much not yet over.